Before 1910, we operated off a gold standard, and a gold standard was pretty much the regulator of governments and central banks. It regulated the amount, the monetary policy of those that were excessively printing money, because if they ruined their currencies and printed too much of it, then everybody would sell it in exchange for gold, and that would lead to a depletion of their gold reserves. Now, gold only expands at approximately 2% per year in its supply, and therefore, for the last 5,000 years, has become hard money. In 1910, a bunch of bankers and politicians met up in a secret island on Jekyll Island in order to design the financial system to favor the US dollar and to favor the banking industry and the US in order to gain control by becoming a reserve currency and designing the financial system as we know it today. Based upon what they learned and what they crafted, in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was launched at Christmas Eve of 1913, when nobody cared to show up because they were all celebrating Christmas, to introduce a change that presidents in America before that literally would fight wars over in order to prevent the banks taking over the monetary system. But the Federal Reserve Act was launched in 1913, and that gave the Federal Reserve the control over money printing alongside the commercial banks. And so more importantly, the central bank took the role of using interest rates and monetary policy in order to design how much money the private commercial banks were creating. This was the birth of the debt-based monetary system. Now, at that time, we were, prior to that, operating off a hard money system, and we moved over to what's called a receipt and credit money system. A receipt and credit money system is where, when you left your gold at a bank or where you left it at a central bank, you were issued a receipt on a piece of paper that stated how much gold you were entitled to. Well, the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 gave the ability for banks and commercial banks to expand those receipt money, exponentially into what's known as credit money, which is where people started trading receipts for gold that did not exist, and significantly expanding the money supply. By significantly expanding the money supply, the US government, during the time of the fall of the British Empire, the US government were able to expand their expenditure on military. And in 1914, we entered into our First World War. In our First World War, the money supply was increased significantly as a result of the Federal Reserve Act passing, and that led to a 115% increase in the supply of these Federal Reserve notes and receipts for gold through credit money and money that was backed by debt. And so that funded the war. Now, in 1918, the war efforts ended. There was a redevelopment. And in 1920, very few economists cover this, but there was a depression in the 1920s. Most people talk about the 1929 stock market crash, and that led to the Great Depression of the 1930s. But in 1920, there was a depression as a result of the excessive money printing and inflation that raged when money is printed unproductively in order to expend on military. It is very unproductive, very inefficient, and leads to inflation, much like we are experiencing right now. So that led to a depression in the 1920s and a big cost of living crisis that they were experiencing. But the difference with this one is that the money supply was not increased as a solution to the financial crisis. So rather than having the Great Depression, or the depression at that time, funded by money printing, the money supply was actually allowed to contract, and the markets were actually allowed to do their thing for the last time in history. And that led to a very quick recovery of the depression in 1921. But after 1921, the Federal Reserve took out the printing press again and increased the supply of dollars by approximately 68% in what was known as the Roaring Twenties. Those Roaring Twenties were plagued by stock market bubbles, by bond market bubbles, by real estate bubbles, and everybody was borrowing money in order to speculate, leading to a lot of wealth inequality. Those that were borrowing in order to consume ended up on the wrong side of financial history. Those that were borrowing in order to purchase real estate, stocks, and bonds ended up on the right side of financial history until we had a big crash due to the big overexposure of indebtedness that happened in 1929. The result of that is that we then had a 42%, and we had the 1933 Roosevelt reforms that separated retail commercial banking from investment banking, regulatory, big regulatory expansions, an increase of the money supply, 42%. But remember, this is a much larger increased money supply. And the depression that lasted between 1929 and 1939, known as the Great Depression of the 1930s. That then led to the next event, which was obviously the Second World War, which kicked off in 1941, led to a big increase in the money supply and expansion of dollars through issuing war bonds. So then back in the days, if you wanted to fund things like wars, rather than go into your central bank and asking them to print up a bunch of money and cause an inflation so that everybody pays indirectly and you have a cost of living crisis, instead they used to have to reach out to investors and say, will you invest in funding the war? And if investors wanted to invest, they could purchase some bonds. If they didn't, then they wouldn't purchase bonds and not enough money would be raised. And so back in the day, in order to wage wars before central banks went rampant, you needed to actually sell that concept. So and that led to less conflict, less wars being funded, but money printing led to the ability for individuals, companies to have to pay their war efforts through inflation and cost of living crisis. The way to combat that was to purchase real estate because the money would make its way into asset bubbles. And then the Federal Reserve and the central banks all around the world went into a crazy experiment of saying that markets can never fail and correct. So once the war was over, in 1944, an English economist called John Maynard Keynes went to a meeting in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in order to design and redesign the financial system for the post-war development. During this post-war development, John Maynard Keynes actually wanted to introduce the equivalent of a global central bank digital currency called the Bancor. And that Bancor was rejected in favor of the US dollar based upon a promise. And that promise was that it would be convertible into a fixed amount of gold. It was approximately $20 at the time. And in 1944, 32 central banks all met up and said that they will peg their currency at a fixed rate to the dollar. And the US dollar will be fixed and pegged at a fixed rate to hard money that cannot be changed, that only increases its supply at 2% per annum. Then commercial banks could create money when they issue loans, but it would be really regulated by the supply of gold. And if they created too much money and created too much inflation, because all the other countries were pegged to it, it would ruin their economies, and the US would be exporting their inflation across all the other countries. It was regulated by the fact that it was backed by gold. That led to somewhat of a control and somewhat of a receipt money and Federal Reserve notes and credit money that was created by the banks being backed and having some kind of regulator by nature because of gold. But in 1971, they wanted to fund more and more military. And by funding more and more military and working with the Bank of England, they decided in 1971, President Nixon, because they were about to lose all of their gold supplies, that they wanted to flood the world with dollars. And to flood the world with dollars, President Nixon reneged and said, for your patriotic duties, we are removing the convertibility of the dollar into gold. And so now all the currencies became floated against each other, and we entered into the biggest, world's largest regulated debt-based Ponzi scheme the world has ever seen. And so in 1971, also, I forgot to say, in 1944, in order to regulate the convertibility of gold into the central banks that were convertible into the dollar, they created the International Monetary Fund. Now, the IMF no longer had a role in 1971 because they removed the convertibility of gold, and so that process didn't need to be managed. So instead, the International Monetary Fund, which set up their base in Washington, D.C., posing as a global organization, decided to flood developing countries with dollars so that they could then use the expanding money supply to set up military bases across the world through US foreign policies. Those US foreign policies were set up whereby countries needed to take loans, and those loans would make their way back into the United States, because those loans would come with terms and conditions. And those terms and conditions were that you had to spend them back into the United States, which would cripple those countries with the United States dollar debt, no ability to print their money like the United States can in order to get out of that debt without creating hyperinflation in the countries that did that. And that's exactly what happened in countries like Argentina, like Zimbabwe, and other countries, as well as one of the highest debtors to the IMF at the moment being Ukraine. So in 1971, this policy changed the world, and the International Monetary Fund became a predator, giving out economic hitman loans across the world, getting the world addicted to dollars that were backed by nothing. And now that everybody started using dollars, and approximately 50% of trade started happening in US dollars now, if you look at it, and central banks all around the world, they already had lots of treasury debt, and they already had dollars. So they started lending their dollars to the US government, allowing them to expand their supply, and create the largest military base the world has ever seen. To combat this in 2008, because there was no check and control on the creation of dollars, and dollars became more and more important, in 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto launched the Bitcoin white paper that introduced a peer-to-peer electronic cash system whereby it would be completely apolitical, independent of geopolitics, and have a fixed supply and have a fixed rate of release of those newly created Bitcoins. By 2010, we launched banktothefuture.com, which was a company that was looking to create a bank that allowed people to own their own money, spend their own money, and have benefit from money ownership without creating loans every time we issued that. We completely failed in that mission because the regulator said, you have to create money. You're going to need to put 60 million pounds at the Bank of England, and Simon Dixon, you're going to have to step down as a CEO and hire another banker in order to run such a bank. So we pivoted the business, and instead decided to use it in order to fund Bitcoin companies that were building financial innovation on top of a monetary system whose supply was completely fixed, and gave people the ability to own their own money, spend their own money, and have a supply that was inflation resistant. So I personally was deep in debt from trying to create a bank, and I took my last bit of credit card debt, myself and my wife Bliss, and we went over to the first Bitcoin conference in 2011 and launched my book, Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust, which went through how to protect yourself in this rapidly changing financial system, and became the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin. We also started to meet some of the first companies. Max Kaiser was there, and we started to invest in various different companies. In 2013, I sat around a table with a bunch of industry people and met Boris Johnson to share with them how the UK could become the leader in Bitcoin. We created the UK Digital Currency Association, and we told them that the financial system is going to have a radically different future. Gave him my book, Bank to the Future. And essentially what he ended up doing was funding our competition that weren't involved in Bitcoin through UK government subsidies, and then used the name Bank to the Future and launched a campaign called Bus to the Future in order to fund UK businesses through alternative companies that weren't using Bitcoin. So he drove us out of the UK, didn't want to support the industry. And then that led us to, in 2014, going to the first country that was working with the UK, the Isle of Man, that wanted to support the growth of the Bitcoin industry. We spoke at a conference with the government where they started to announce their first steps to make Bitcoin legal tender and allow people to pay their taxes in Bitcoin, started announcing tax exemptions, and started trying to get all the businesses in Bitcoin over to the island in order to support the growth of the industry. But then the Bank of England knocked on the door of the Isle of Man government and said, if you support this industry, we have control over the clearing of the Manx pound through the Bank of England. And at that moment, the regulator said no. The banks decided that they wouldn't give bank accounts to anyone that was supporting the industry. And the government, through all of their efforts, failed at their task at making Bitcoin legal tender and supporting the growth of this industry. At this moment, we launched at Bank to the Future the first Bitcoin bond that was paying out thousands of Bitcoin. We launched the first venture capital fund that was paying out thousands of Bitcoin by investing in mining. And the price of Bitcoin was at approximately $250 in this moment. We then started allowing our investors to invest in all the companies that built the industry, many of the household names. We had a portion of their funding rounds as the industry grew, and it became the highest performing asset class the world has ever seen. And so because so many investors got wealthy, they started reinvesting into the companies that were innovating the industry further, and our industry became a multi-trillion-dollar industry, and Bitcoin became a significant player. In 2016, I released a video warning the world that central bank digital currencies will be the mechanism of the future for taking away people's freedoms. And it is inevitable, predictable, and guaranteed. And shortly after, China launched and started talking about their first central bank digital currency. A few years later, myself and Jim Rogers did a tour across China at lots of different regions. And that's when there's the movement of the central bank digital currency started to accelerate as more and more people started to look at Bitcoin, and the industry got bigger and bigger and bigger. In 2019, we started working on a video series, which we've put live for those that haven't watched it yet on retirementplanb.com. That's retirementplanb.com, where I shared with people, based upon a video I uploaded to YouTube in 2011 and a talk that I gave in 2009 called The Great Depression of the 2020s. I wanted to protect as many people from what I was calling the Great Depression of the 2020s and share people how to protect themselves from inflation, deflation, economic growth, economic decline, bank failures, wars, pandemics, and everything that can follow when you increase the money supply so significantly as is happening today, and we transition of a world of hard money into a world of central bank digital currencies that have unlimited printing and algorithms that can take away the freedoms of people based upon many law changes that have happened over time, and the importance of making sure that people understand the different ways to protect themselves in such a time. In 2020, that went live, and then we started to see other companies implement the strategy that we had at Bank to the Future, where we essentially at Bank to the Future created the first company Bitcoin standard, where we held all of our Bitcoin on our balance sheet. We earned revenue in Bitcoin, and we kept that revenue in Bitcoin. And as the market got more sophisticated and we started to fund more companies, MicroStrategy, founded by Michael Saylor, became the first public company to implement the Bitcoin standard into a public company. Shortly after, Tesla started to divest some of its dollars into Bitcoin, and started supporting the industry in trying to become more clean energy, as a natural progression now that Bitcoin became the largest supercomputer in the world. In 2021, President Bukele, at the Bitcoin 2020 conference, or 2021 conference, I believe, I forget my history now, announced Bitcoin as legal tender and fulfilled the mission that we tried to support the UK in achieving, the Isle of Man in achieving, and Bukele stood up to the International Monetary Fund, stood up to the Bank of England, and stood up to the people at the Federal Reserve and in US Congress right now that are writing and introducing bills in order to investigate the risk that President Bukele and El Salvador and Bitcoin pose to the strength of the US economy. Biden then announced in 2022 a US executive order in order to gain a competitive edge against China, who had banned Bitcoin and is now starting to capitulate into investigating how it can work with Bitcoin rather than giving it all to the US. We now enter into a world of central bank digital currencies that are backed by nothing, based upon agreements that were reneged, and the world's largest regulated Ponzi scheme of fiat currency, competing in an environment where everybody can now enter into their own voluntary Bitcoin standard as an individual, as a company, and as a country. So I flew over on a jet over to meet the government in El Salvador to support them. And Bank to the Future is also applying for a license in 2022 in order to support more financial inclusion into the industry, now that regulators around the world are allowing only the rich to get richer. Unfortunately, our license would only allow high net worth people to use it at this stage. But we are applying for additional licenses, and I believe that there is a vision for the Wall Street of Bitcoin to be created across Latin America and across different countries. And now President Bukele has got together those countries that have been most shafted by the International Monetary Fund, that are most shafted by the inflation that's being exported around the world as a result of the financial system that was designed in 1910. And those are now all meeting to discuss their Bitcoin strategy, their digital strategy, and the reinvention of the financial system based upon a bottom-up movement, not a top-down movement. A top-down movement that I tried to create in the UK, a top-down movement from government that I tried to create in the Isle of Man, but now a bottom-up movement of free market money that was created by Satoshi Nakamoto, adopted by every individual that chose to combat themselves from the tyranny of inflation by holding Bitcoin, protecting their savings, and having money they can own, money they can spend, and money that has a fixed supply. And now every company and every country can voluntarily design and decide how they're going to interact with this financial system without being forced to do that. And that meeting is happening right now.